The rain was relentless, pounding against the windows of the bus as Clara sank into her seat, the weariness from her shift clinging to her like a second skin. She had spent the entire day on her feet, tending to patients, and now all she wanted was to get home. But something about this evening felt different, a tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. As her eyes wandered, they settled on a small figure at the back of the bus, a boy, no more than 6 years old, sitting alone. His tiny frame was hunched over, clutching a worn backpack as if it were his only source of comfort. As the bus continued its route, the passengers gradually dwindled, leaving the boy as one of the last remaining. Clara's concern deepened with each passing stop, her instincts as a nurse kicking in. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The driver, noticing the same, finally spoke up as they reached the end of the line. "Hey kid, this is the last stop. Where are your parents?" But the boy remained motionless, not even a flicker of recognition crossing his face. The silence was deafening, amplifying Clara's growing unease. Unable to ignore the gnawing worry, Clara stood and approached the boy, her steps cautious yet purposeful. Up close, she could see the pallor of his skin, the way his small chest barely moved with each shallow breath. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked, her voice gentle but tinged with urgency. She reached out to touch his shoulder, half expecting him to pull away, but he remained eerily still. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the gravity of the situation. The boy wasn't just asleep, he was unconscious. "Driver, we need to get him to a clinic now." Clara's voice was firm, cutting through the growing panic that threatened to overtake her. The driver quickly moved to assist, his own face pale with concern. Together, they carried the boy out into the pouring rain, Clara's arms wrapped protectively around his fragile form. The night was cold, the rain soaking them through as they hurried down the deserted street, but Clara barely noticed. All that mattered was getting this child the help he so desperately needed. The clinic wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but every second felt like an eternity. Clara's mind raced with questions. Who was this boy? And how had he ended up alone on a bus in such a dire state? But there was no time for answers, only action. They burst through the clinic doors, and immediately, Clara's colleagues sprang into motion, their faces a blur of professionalism and concern. The boy was whisked away into the emergency room, leaving Clara standing in the corridor, soaked and shivering, her heart pounding with fear. As the minutes dragged on, Clara found herself pacing the sterile hallway, her mind replaying the events over and over. She couldn't shake the image of the boy's lifeless face, the way his small hand had felt so cold in hers. There was something about him that tugged at her heart, a connection she couldn't explain. She knew it was more than just a professional duty. It was something deeper, more personal, and it terrified her. What if they were too late? What if this boy slipped away before she could do anything to help him? Finally, after what felt like hours, one of the doctors emerged from the emergency room, his expression serious but not without hope. "He's stable for now," he said, and Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it did little to calm the storm of emotions raging inside her. The boy was safe, but the questions remained. Who was he? And why had he been alone, unconscious, on that bus? The mystery gnawed at her, refusing to be silenced, even as she tried to focus on the immediate task at hand. Clara's mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that the boy's appearance in her life was no mere coincidence. There was something about him, something that felt oddly familiar, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. As she watched the doctors work to stabilize him, she made a silent vow to find out the truth. Whoever this boy was, whatever had happened to him, She wouldn't rest until she knew the full story. As the night wore on, Clara remained by the boy's side, her hand gently resting on his as he lay unconscious on the hospital bed. The storm outside had begun to subside, but the turmoil within her only grew stronger. She knew that finding out who this child was would change everything for better or worse. And as she sat there in the dim light of the clinic, she couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was only the beginning of a much larger, much darker journey. The clinic buzzed with urgency as Clara took charge of the situation, her years of experience guiding her every move. The boy lay motionless on the gurney, surrounded by the sterile white walls that now felt more like a battlefield than a place of healing. Clara's hands moved swiftly, her fingers checking vitals, her eyes scanning the monitors for any sign of stability. The child's pulse was weak, his breath shallow, and the fear that had gripped her on the bus only tightened its hold. But there was no time to falter. This was a fight for his life. As the medical team worked together, their actions synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance, Clara couldn't shake the thoughts that plagued her mind. How had this child, so small and vulnerable, ended up alone and in such critical condition? The questions loomed over her, demanding answers, but she pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. The room was filled with the hum of machines, the beeping of heart monitors, and the low murmurs of doctors conferring with one another. It was all too familiar, yet this time it felt personal in a way she couldn't explain. Minutes felt like hours as they worked tirelessly, the boy's life hanging by a thread. Clara's heart ached with every shallow breath he took, her mind racing with the knowledge that they were running out of time. She could see the concern etched on the faces of her colleagues, each of them fighting against the growing dread that this might be a battle they couldn't win. But Clara refused to give in to that fear. She had seen miracles happen before, and she clung to the hope that this boy would be another. As the team continued their efforts, Clara found herself drawn closer to the boy, not just physically, but emotionally. There was something about him, something that stirred a deep sense of responsibility within her. She had treated countless patients over the years, many of them children, but this was different. The connection she felt with him was undeniable, and it scared her. She couldn't help but wonder if this was fate, if she was meant to find this boy and save him. The thought brought a mixture of comfort and fear, as she realized how much she was already invested in his survival. With each passing moment, the tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she administered medication, her eyes flickering to the boy's face, pale and still. She whispered silent prayers, pleading with whatever higher power might be listening to spare this child's life. It was more than just a professional obligation now. It was a personal mission. She couldn't let him go. Not like this. Not when he had so much life left to live. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, there was a shift, a small but significant sign of improvement. The boy's pulse grew stronger, his breaths a little deeper. The relief that flooded the room was palpable, a collective exhale as the team realized they might have a chance after all. Clara's knees nearly buckled with the overwhelming surge of emotion, her eyes welling with tears she didn't dare let fall. They weren't out of the woods yet, but there was hope. And for the first time that night, Clara allowed herself to believe that this boy would make it. As the immediate crisis began to stabilize, Clara found herself standing by the boy's side, her hand resting gently on his small, fragile one. The room had quieted, the frenetic energy giving way to a tense calm. The boy was still unconscious, but his vitals had improved, and the doctors had stepped back, giving him space to rest. Clara couldn't tear her eyes away from him, her mind racing with questions that still had no answers. Who was he? Where had he come from? And why did she feel such a deep, unexplainable connection to him? As the hours passed, Clara remained vigilant, unwilling to leave the boy alone for even a moment. The world outside continued on, oblivious to the life and death struggle that had unfolded within these walls. But for Clara, nothing else mattered. This child, this little boy she had found on the bus, had become her world. And she knew, deep in her heart, that she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth behind his mysterious appearance. The bond she felt with him was undeniable, and she vowed to see him through this, no matter what it took. By the time dawn began to break, casting a soft, pale light into the clinic, Clara was exhausted but resolute. The boy had stabilized, his vitals steady, but he remained unconscious, his fate still uncertain. Clara stood by his side, her thoughts a tangled web of worry, hope, and determination. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. The struggle for the boy's life might have been won, but the battle to uncover the truth had only just begun. The clinic was quiet now, the frenetic energy of the night giving way to a tense calm. Clara sat beside the boy's bed, her eyes fixed on his small, fragile form. He had stabilized but remained unconscious, his breath steady but shallow. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something more profound connected her to this child, something beyond the mere chance of finding him on that bus. Her mind replayed the events over and over, the questions multiplying with each passing hour. Who was this boy, and how had he ended up in her care? The first rays of dawn filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by a faint movement, just a twitch, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. She leaned in closer, holding her breath as the boy's eyelids fluttered open. His eyes, a striking shade of blue, stared up at her with a mixture of confusion and fear. Clara's heart swelled with relief and an inexplicable wave of emotion. "Hey there, sweetie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" The boy hesitated, his small hands clutching the blanket as if it were a lifeline. He seemed to struggle for a moment, his brow furrowing in concentration. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Tommy." The name hung in the air, sending a shiver down Clara's spine. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Tommy. The name echoed in her mind, reverberating with a significance she couldn't yet comprehend. It was impossible, too impossible to be true. Clara's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling as she stared at the boy in disbelief. Tommy was the name of her son, the son who had disappeared 6 years ago, vanishing without a trace from a park on a sunny afternoon. She had spent years searching, never giving up hope, even when the trail had gone cold. But now, here was this boy, with the same name, the same age, and those same hauntingly familiar eyes. It couldn't be a coincidence, but the very possibility seemed too cruel, too surreal to believe. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she fought to keep her composure. She couldn't let herself hope, couldn't let herself believe that this boy, this child she had found unconscious on a bus, could be her long-lost son. But the resemblance, the name, it was all too much. Her hands trembled as she reached out, gently brushing a lock of hair from the boy's forehead. "Tommy," she whispered, the name tasting both foreign and familiar on her lips. "Do you remember anything? Where you're from? Where your mommy is?" The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. He shook his head slowly, his small body trembling. I don't know," he stammered, his voice quivering. "I was with a lady, but she's gone. I don't know where I am." Clara's heart clenched at the sight of his fear, her maternal instincts roaring to life. But beneath the concern, there was something else, a flicker of recognition. He was telling the truth. That much she knew. But the details were hazy, and she could sense the confusion swirling in his young mind. Clara struggled to process the flood of emotions washing over her. Could it really be possible? Could this boy be her Tommy, the child she had lost all those years ago? The thought alone was enough to make her dizzy with hope and fear. She had to know, had to be sure. But how? The resemblance was undeniable, but so was the doubt gnawing at her insides. The logical part of her mind screamed that it was impossible, a cruel trick of fate. But her heart, her aching mother's heart, whispered that it could be true. The next few hours passed in a blur, with Clara oscillating between hope and disbelief. She asked the boy more questions, trying to piece together the fragments of his memory. But the answers only deepened the mystery. He remembered little, only the lady who had taken care of him, a vague recollection of a park, and a scar on his knee from a fall. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she asked to see the scar. And there was a small, faded mark that matched exactly where Tommy had been injured in that park so many years ago. The confirmation, as small as it was, sent Clara's heart racing. It was all too much, too overwhelming to process at once. She needed answers, definitive proof that this boy was who she so desperately wanted him to be. But how? The thought of losing him again, of finding out that he wasn't her son after all, was almost too painful to bear. And yet, the hope, the slim possibility that she had found her Tommy, kept her going. She had to know, had to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost her emotionally. As the day wore on, Clara couldn't shake the growing sense of certainty in her heart. She knew it was irrational, knew that she needed more proof before she could truly believe it. But every time she looked into the boy's eyes, she saw a piece of her past, a fragment of the son she had lost. And with every passing moment, the hope that this boy was her Tommy grew stronger, pushing away the doubt and fear that had plagued her for so long. But along with that hope came a new fear, a fear of what she might uncover and what it would mean for both of them. As the initial shock began to wear off, Clara found herself grappling with a tidal wave of emotions. The possibility that the boy lying in the hospital bed was her long-lost son was almost too much to bear. Her heart ached with a mixture of hope and fear, each emotion battling for dominance. She knew she had to find out the truth, but the thought of what she might discover terrified her. What if she was wrong? What if this was just a cruel twist of fate? A boy who shared her son's name and features, but was not truly him. Clara couldn't let herself get swept away by her emotions, no matter how strong they were. She needed to stay grounded, to approach this with the same calm, rational mind that had served her well as a nurse. But it was easier said than done. Every time she looked at the boy, Tommy, she saw her son, the child she had lost and mourned for years. The resemblance was uncanny, and the small details he remembered only added fuel to the fire of her hope. But she needed more than memories and scars. She needed proof. Driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth, Clara began her investigation. She spoke with the doctors, the nurses, anyone who might have a clue about the boy's past. But there were no easy answers. The boy had been found with no identification, no belongings except the tattered backpack he clung to so tightly. The authorities were contacted, and an inquiry was launched, but it would take time. Time that Clara wasn't sure she could endure. Every minute felt like an eternity, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. Unable to sit idly by, Clara decided to dig deeper on her own. She spent hours talking to Tommy, gently probing his memories, trying to piece together the puzzle of his past. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this was her son. He remembered details that only her Tommy would know, a favorite bedtime story, the nickname she used to call him, the scar on his knee from that fateful day in the park. Each revelation brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to the edge of an emotional abyss. Clara's nights became sleepless, her mind racing with possibilities, her heart torn between hope and despair. She would sit by Tommy's bed, watching over him as he slept, her thoughts a whirlwind of memories and questions. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too surreal, too miraculous to be true. And yet, the evidence was mounting, pointing her toward the one conclusion she so desperately wanted to believe. But the fear of being wrong, of losing him all over again, was a constant shadow that loomed over her every thought. The days stretched on, each one bringing a new piece of the puzzle, but never the whole picture. Clara reached out to anyone who might have information, old friends, family members, even private investigators. She was relentless in her pursuit of the truth, driven by a need that went beyond logic, beyond reason. This was her son. She could feel it in her bones, in her very soul. But she needed something concrete, something undeniable, to prove that what she felt in her heart was real. And until she had that proof, she couldn't rest. As Clara's investigation deepened, so did her connection with Tommy. The more time she spent with him, the more convinced she became that this was her boy. He had the same gentle spirit, the same inquisitive mind that she remembered so well. And yet, there were moments when the fear would creep in, when she would catch herself doubting. What if she was wrong? What if this was just a cruel coincidence? A boy who had been through so much and was now caught up in her desperate search for closure. The thought was almost too painful to bear. The tipping point came one afternoon when Clara noticed something she had overlooked before, a small, faded birthmark on Tommy's left shoulder, just below the collarbone. It was the same birthmark her son had, a tiny imperfection that she had always thought of as a secret sign. A unique mark that only a mother would know. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she traced the outline with trembling fingers. It was undeniable. This was her son. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, overwhelming her with a mixture of relief and sorrow. But with the certainty came a new challenge, a need to confront the reality of what had happened. How had Tommy ended up on that bus, alone and unconscious? Where had he been all these years, and who had taken him from her? The questions were daunting, and Clara knew that finding the answers would not be easy. But she was ready. She had found her son, against all odds, and now she would do whatever it took to protect him, to keep him safe. The search for the truth was far from over, but at least now she knew where to begin. With the confirmation of Tommy's identity, Clara's world tilted once more, but this time with a sense of fierce determination. The revelation that the boy she had found was indeed her long-lost son filled her with a mix of joy and dread. Joy for the miracle of finding him, but dread for the questions that still loomed large. How had her son ended up alone and unconscious on a bus? And who had been caring for him all these years? Clara knew that to protect her son, she needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Clara wasted no time in alerting the authorities about her discovery. The police were immediately involved, opening a formal investigation into Tommy's disappearance and the years he had spent away from her. The process was grueling, filled with endless interviews, paperwork, and an overwhelming sense of unease. Clara was asked to recount the day Tommy disappeared, a day she had relived in her mind countless times. The pain was still raw, but now it was coupled with a burning need for justice. Whoever had taken her son needed to be held accountable. As the investigation progressed, Clara remained by Tommy's side, refusing to leave him for even a moment. She knew that the answers they sought would not come easily, but she was prepared for the long road ahead. The police combed through records, questioned witnesses, and followed every lead, no matter how small. Meanwhile, Clara worked tirelessly to regain the trust of her son, who was still disoriented and frightened by the recent events. She could see the fear in his eyes, the confusion that clouded his young mind, and it broke her heart. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation seemed to move at a snail's pace. Clara's frustration grew with each passing day, the lack of progress gnawing at her. She had waited so long to find her son, and now that he was finally back in her life, the thought of losing him again, either physically or emotionally, was unbearable. The police discovered that Tommy had been seen with a woman who claimed to be his mother. She had taken him from a temporary shelter, only to disappear without a trace. The woman's identity was a mystery, and tracking her down became the primary focus of the investigation. The more Clara learned, the more her anxiety grew. The woman who had taken Tommy was a ghost, leaving behind little more than a trail of questions. Who was she? Why had she taken Tommy? And what had she done to keep him hidden all these years? Clara's mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. The police began to explore darker avenues, including the possibility that Tommy had been part of an illegal adoption ring or even a victim of abduction. The thought made Clara's blood run cold, but she knew she couldn't shy away from the truth. The investigation also uncovered a network of illegal activities, including child trafficking and illegal adoptions, that seemed to intersect with Tommy's case. The realization that her son might have been caught up in something so sinister shook Clara to her core. She couldn't help but feel a deep, overwhelming guilt. How had she failed to protect him? How had he slipped through her fingers and into the hands of such dangerous people? The self-recrimination was relentless, even as she tried to focus on the task at hand, finding the woman who had taken him and bringing her to justice. As the net began to close around the suspects, Clara found herself struggling to keep her emotions in check. The investigation was taking its toll on her, both physically and emotionally. She was exhausted, her nerves frayed, but she couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Not when they were so close to finding the answers they needed. The police managed to trace the woman to a small town outside the city, where she had been living under an assumed identity. The discovery sent shockwaves through Clara, filling her with a mix of fear and anticipation. The final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a story more heartbreaking than Clara had imagined. The woman who had taken Tommy had found him abandoned in a park, alone and crying. Unable to have children of her own, she had taken him in and raised him as her own, hiding him from the authorities out of fear of losing him. But as the police closed in, she had panicked, leaving him on that bus in the hope that someone would find him and care for him. Clara's heart ached for the woman's desperation, but it did little to temper her anger and grief. With the truth finally emerging, Clara knew that the next steps would be the hardest. Confronting the woman who had taken her son, coming to terms with the years they had lost, and helping Tommy adjust to his new reality. These were challenges that would test her strength and resolve. But she was ready. She had found her son, and she wasn't going to let him go again. The investigation had brought them to the brink, but now it was time to face the consequences, to heal, and to move forward together. The small town where the woman had been hiding was quiet, almost too peaceful for the storm of emotions brewing within Clara. The drive there had been tense, filled with a silence heavy with anticipation. Clara sat in the back of the police car, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind racing with thoughts of what was about to unfold. She was on the brink of confronting the woman who had taken her son, a woman she had come to view as both a villain and a victim. The conflicting emotions tore at her, but one thing was clear: this confrontation would change everything. As they pulled up to the modest house on the outskirts of town, Clara's heart pounded in her chest, a mix of fear and determination coursing through her veins. The police officers exchanged brief words before stepping out of the car, their expressions stern and professional. Clara followed suit, her legs feeling weak beneath her. The house looked so ordinary, so unassuming, yet it held the answers to the questions that had haunted her for years. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The knock on the door echoed in the stillness, each second that passed heightening the tension. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked older than her years, her face etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. Clara recognized her instantly from the photos the police had shown her. This was the woman who had taken her son, who had hidden him away for years, and who had ultimately left him alone on that bus. The woman's eyes widened in fear as she saw the officers, and then her gaze fell on Clara. Recognition flickered there, followed by a deep, aching sorrow. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the two women stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words. Clara's emotions roiled within her. Anger, pain, confusion, but also a deep, unexpected empathy. She had imagined this moment so many times, had pictured herself screaming, demanding answers, but now that it was here, all she could feel was an overwhelming sadness. The woman in front of her wasn't a monster. She was a broken, desperate soul who had made a terrible choice. Clara's voice trembled as she finally spoke. "Why? Why did you take him?" The woman's shoulders slumped, as if a great weight had settled upon them. She looked down, unable to meet Clara's eyes. I found him in the park," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. "He was all alone, crying. I tried to find his parents, but when no one came, I just couldn't leave him there. I took him home, and I kept him safe. I know it was wrong, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing him." Her words were a confession, a plea for understanding, and they cut through Clara like a knife. Clara's hands shook as she listened, the reality of the situation hitting her with full force. This woman had taken her son, had stolen years of his life and hers, but she had also cared for him, protected him when no one else could. The anger that had driven her to this moment began to crumble, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. "You had no right," Clara said, her voice thick with tears. "You had no right to take him from me. Do you know what I've been through? What he's been through?" The woman's tears flowed freely now, her guilt and remorse laid bare for all to see. "I know," she sobbed. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone. I couldn't let him go. He became my whole world. But when I realized what I'd done, that I'd kept him from his real mother, I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. That's why I left him on the bus. I thought maybe he'd find his way back to where he belonged." The raw emotion in her voice pierced Clara's heart, and for a moment, she was lost in a sea of conflicting feelings. Clara stepped closer, her resolve softening as she looked into the woman's tear-streaked face. "You did what you thought was right, but it wasn't your decision to make," she said, her tone softer now, tinged with a deep sadness. "You took him from his family, from his life, and now we're all paying the price." The woman nodded, her face a mask of sorrow and regret. There was nothing more to be said. The police stepped forward, gently placing handcuffs on the woman's wrists as she offered no resistance, her eyes filled with a resignation that broke Clara's heart. As the woman was led away, Clara stood in the doorway, her body trembling with the intensity of the confrontation. She had found her son, but the cost had been immense. The years they had lost could never be regained, and the scars left by this ordeal would take a lifetime to heal. But there was also a sense of closure, a sense that the truth had finally been revealed, and now they could begin to heal. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift, replaced by the fragile hope of a new beginning. The drive back to the city was a somber one, the weight of the confrontation still heavy in Clara's heart. She had found the answer she was looking for, but the reality of the situation was bittersweet. Tommy was safe, but the years they had lost, the moments they would never get back, hung like a shadow over her relief. Now there was one final step to take, a DNA test to confirm, without a doubt, that Tommy was indeed her son. The thought of it made Clara's stomach churn with anxiety, but she knew it was necessary. Back at the clinic, the atmosphere was tense as the doctors prepared to take the DNA samples. Clara watched as they swabbed the inside of Tommy's cheek, her heart pounding in her chest. The boy was quiet, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he sensed the importance of the moment. Clara squeezed his hand gently, offering what little comfort she could. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "We're just making sure everything's right." The next few days were a blur of waiting, the hours stretching into what felt like an eternity. Clara couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of the impending results. What if, after all this, the test proved that Tommy wasn't her son? The very idea was too painful to bear, and yet it lingered in the back of her mind, a gnawing fear that refused to be silenced. She tried to distract herself, throwing herself into work, spending every free moment with Tommy, but the anxiety was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Finally, the day arrived. Clara sat in the doctor's office, her hands trembling as she waited for the results. Tommy sat beside her, his small hand clutched tightly in hers, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of what was at stake. The doctor entered, his expression calm but serious, a sealed envelope in his hand. Clara's breath caught in her throat as he handed it to her, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a physical force. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was inside. With trembling hands, Clara tore open the envelope, her eyes scanning the document inside. The world seemed to stop as she read the words that confirmed what she had hoped for, what she had feared to hope for. The DNA test was a match. Tommy was her son. Relief flooded through her, so overwhelming that it left her breathless, tears streaming down her face. She pulled Tommy into her arms, holding him close, her heart bursting with a mixture of joy and sorrow. "You're my boy," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're really my boy." The confirmation brought a sense of closure, a final piece of the puzzle falling into place. But it also brought with it a wave of grief for the years they had lost, for the birthdays, the holidays, the everyday moments that had been stolen from them. Clara knew that healing would take time, that the scars of this ordeal would never fully fade. But now, at least, they could begin to move forward. She looked down at Tommy, his face pressed against her shoulder, and felt a surge of love so fierce it took her breath away. They were together again, and that was all that mattered. Over the next few days, Clara and Tommy began the slow process of rebuilding their lives. The investigation continued, but for Clara, the focus shifted from finding answers to helping her son adjust to his new reality. Tommy was quiet, still processing everything that had happened, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Clara saw a glimmer of the boy she had lost so many years ago. She clung to those moments, drawing strength from them as they navigated the difficult road ahead. The reunion with her family was bittersweet. There were tears of joy, but also of sorrow for what could never be undone. Clara's parents, who had mourned the loss of their grandson, welcomed Tommy with open arms, but the pain of the past lingered. They too had to come to terms with the years they had missed, the moments they would never get back. But despite the challenges, there was a sense of hope, a belief that together they could heal. The wounds were deep, but the love that bound them together was stronger. As the days turned into weeks, Clara began to see a change in Tommy. He was still quiet, still guarded, but there were moments when he would smile, when he would reach for her hand without prompting. Those moments were like rays of sunshine breaking through the clouds, a sign that the healing had begun. Clara knew they had a long way to go, but she was ready to face whatever came next, as long as they were together. The final verification had given her the peace she needed, the certainty that this was her son, and now they could start to rebuild the life they had lost. In the weeks that followed the confirmation of Tommy's identity, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The years of pain, the relentless search, and the countless sleepless nights had all led to this moment, reuniting with her son. The overwhelming emotions of joy and relief were tempered by the sorrow of what had been lost. But through it all, one truth remained clear. It was love and perseverance that had carried them through. Clara had never given up hope, even when the odds seemed insurmountable, and now that hope had been rewarded. Clara watched as Tommy slowly began to adjust to his new life. It wasn't easy. There were days when the trauma of the past weighed heavily on him, when the memories of his time away would surface and cast a shadow over his progress. But Clara was patient, understanding that healing would take time. She saw in Tommy a resilience that matched her own, a quiet strength that gave her hope for their future. Every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory, a testament to the bond they shared and the power of a mother's love. The journey hadn't just changed Tommy, it had transformed Clara as well. She had been forced to confront her deepest fears, to face the possibility of never finding her son. And in doing so, she had discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The woman who had once been consumed by grief and guilt had emerged on the other side with a renewed sense of purpose. Clara knew that the scars of the past would never fully heal, but she also knew that they didn't have to define their future. Together, she and Tommy could build something new, something stronger. As they settled into a new routine, Clara found herself grateful for the simple things. The sound of Tommy's laughter, the way he would reach for her hand, the quiet moments they shared at the end of the day. These were the moments that had been stolen from them, but now they were hers to cherish. Clara knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, that there would be setbacks and difficult days, but she was ready to face them. She had her son back, and that was worth more than anything in the world. The power of love and perseverance was evident not just in their reunion, but in the way it had brought healing to those around them as well. Clara's parents, who had mourned the loss of their grandson for years, found solace in having him back in their lives. The community that had supported Clara during her search now rallied around them, offering their love and encouragement as they rebuilt their lives. Even the woman who had taken Tommy, now facing the consequences of her actions, found a measure of peace in knowing that he was back where he belonged. Clara often found herself reflecting on the events that had brought them to this point, the twists of fate that had led her to find Tommy on that bus. It was as if the universe had conspired to bring them back together, a testament to the idea that love, no matter how challenged, always finds a way. The pain of the past would never be forgotten, but it had been transformed into a strength, a reminder of what they had overcome. Clara had learned that true love is not just about holding on, but about letting go of fear, of anger, of the need to control, and trusting that love will guide you where you need to be. As the days turned into months, Clara and Tommy continued to heal, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The trauma of the past would always be a part of their story, but it no longer held the power it once did. Instead, it had been replaced by a deep, abiding love that gave them the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Clara knew that they still had a long way to go, but she was no longer afraid. The love that had carried her through the darkest times would continue to be their guiding light. In the end, Clara realized that the journey she and Tommy had taken was not just about finding each other, but about finding themselves. They had both been lost in different ways, but now they had been found. The power of love and perseverance had given them a second chance, and Clara was determined to make the most of it. She would spend the rest of her life making up for the years they had lost, creating new memories to replace the ones that had been stolen. And in doing so, she knew that they would both find the peace they so desperately deserved. As Clara and Tommy's story shows, love and perseverance have the power to overcome even the darkest of times. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. Share your thoughts in the comments. What did this story mean to you? And if you'd like to support us in bringing more stories like this, consider contributing through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us.